But the economic theories of Keynes is very bipartisan, and right now we're in a recession, which was a predictable recession. When a Federal Reserve inflates and distorts, there always has to be a correction, and we're in the middle of that. But what did Keynes say that we should do when we have an economic downturn? He never admits it's caused by the government. It's always capitalism that was at fault. So the Keynesians say, you know what you should do is spend more money, have more deficits, borrow more money, and print more money and regulate more. And then you ask the question, well, how did we get into this mess? We spent too much money, we borrowed too much money, we printed too much money, and we regulated too much. The financial bubble that is trying to unwind right now over great resistance against the Federal Reserve, actually this bubble, I believe, started in 1971 when the last link to gold was removed and everything's been a bubble building and building. I am convinced that we are in the midst of the early correction of the biggest bubble in the history of the world, and that there's still a long way to go. The monetary creation and all has just been so gigantic. Just think of what was required to keep this from, rapidly deflating. And that was $2 trillion by the Federal Reserve. You know, Ralph was mentioning about how much $1 trillion weigh. You know, today we don't have to weigh it. That's a good example. But the whole thing is, Bernanke and his crowd created $2 trillion within weeks and spent it, and we're not even allowed to know where he spent it. That's why I say it's time to audit the Fed. Then after we audit the Fed, the people of this country will know it's time to end the Fed. Times are coming around for us because the one thing is, as powerful as they are, and as influential they are, ultimately, economic law rules in the end, and economic law and the government is competing. Economic law says when there are mistakes made, when there's too much development and too much regulations, the economic law says you have to back off, you have to pay the debt, you have to work harder and get back to the basics and get back to the fundamentals. But the government says, no, you can't do that. So everything the Fed and the Treasury and the Congress has done, and both parties have done it, it started in the last administration, was they were trying to prevent the correction. So we knew the housing bubble was there. The Austrian free market economists have warned about this for years and years and how much trouble it was going to cause. So what is the policies of our government today? Well, the inflation caused the housing prices to go up, and everybody thought that was good, so they borrowed more and more money. Everybody was supposed to have a house, and we had this Community Reinvestment Act. No down payments, the whole works. The emphasis of buy, more, the prices get too high, so the market says they have to come down. So what have our policies been since the crash started? To keep the prices of houses very high and to get the builders to build more houses. Well, you don't need that. You need fewer houses, and you need the prices to go down as quickly as possible and get it over with. If people give you an argument about that and say, what do you have against poor people? You know, there are a few poor people out there that save their money. If the prices go down, maybe some of these poor people can buy their house now instead of you artificially keeping it up. You know, and I get after Bernanke all the time for various reasons, but one thing I press him on whenever the subject comes up, and that has to do with his fixing of interest rates. He has no right to fix interest rates. Why should he fix interest rates at less than 1% for his banking friends? But if you have to go borrow, you're going to pay a lot more. But because he regulates and has a lot to do with interest rates, who does it really hurt? It hurts really the people who save, who want to take care of themselves. What if you're on a fixed income? What about the retired people? What if you want to, and you don't want to be in the stock market, and you don't have apartments to live off of? You want to have your money in a CD. What right does the Federal Reserve have to fix that price and get it down to 1 or 2% income when the market would say you deserve 6 or 7%? That's wrong, and we shouldn't permit it to happen. The economy obviously is very weak. They try to talk us into believing that where it's just around the corner, it's going to come back to healthy growth again. The GDP is up. You know, the GDP is up a little bit, but the truth is, if government spends money, if they spend the money on something like a tank or a bomb, that goes into the GDP. But what happens to the tank or the bomb? You know, it goes someplace and gets blown up. The country doesn't get wealthier. Somebody made some profits building it. The war profiteers make some money, but that goes into the GDP. So the whole thing is the more money the government spends, the more money they borrow, and the more money they print, the higher the GDP goes up. So it's not a good number to look at, and it doesn't represent economic growth. Economic growth comes from people working hard, savings. Savings has to create the capital. Capital can't come out of a computer. And this is the fallacy of the economics that we have followed. Low interest rates is supposed to indicate there's a lot of savings, and it's an indication that investors can buy and build houses and go out and do major investments. But when interest rates are very low and there's no savings, where do they get the money? Of course, it comes out of thin air, and that's how you get all the mistakes made and all the debt, the pyramiding of debt, and that's where the bubble comes from. It is understandable. It has been explained very well. Mises explained it back as early as 1912 and predicted the Depression of the 1930s, as well as so many of the Austrians predicted exactly what's happening now. And the other day, I was talking to Geithner, Secretary of Treasury, about this, arguing the case for the Austrian economists. I said, they've been right all along, and they made these predictions. Why don't you go and ask the Austrian economists what to do right now? That's what they ought to do. You know, one of the other major changes that has occurred over these decades, not only in economic policy, but it's also in a political sense of what's happening with the power structures. The founders were geniuses in devising a system of separation and balance of powers, not only the three branches of governments, but as well as the separations of powers among the states. I mean, they were supposed to be very limited power to the federal government, and it was supposed to be strictly limited by Article 1, Section 8. You say you can't do anything else other than Article 1, Section 8, and to make sure you don't, the 9th and 10th Amendment was put in, and therefore everything else was reserved for the states and to the people. But we are so far gone from that. You know, since all throughout the 20th century, the undermining of the principle of the states' rights issue. They've turned that into a nasty word, that the sovereignty of the states have been literally undermined. That is why this whole movement right now of the states getting very frightened and very fed up, saying it's time to re-emphasize the principle of nullification in the 10th Amendment. You know, we talk a lot more recently now about nullification, the federal government or the state governments nullifying the federal laws that are unconstitutional. And I, of course, think that is very good. But there is another principle that's available to all of us now. And if you haven't studied this, you really should, because it's available to every single person in this room who ever has or might serve on a jury. It's called jury nullification.